What would happen if every human being on Earth disappeared? At some point in the future, this could be the fate of our planet. This isn't the story of how we might vanish. It is the story of what happens to the world we leave behind. Years after People, the sound of snapping steel reverberates down the corroded canyons of New York City. The cables of the suspension bridges connecting Manhattan to Brooklyn and Queens are failing. The roadway of the Brooklyn Bridge is held up by just over 1,000 vertical suspender or hanger cables, each about the thickness of a human wrist. Each cable is made up of 7 strands of steel twisted around each other, a total of 100 miles of steel in every cable. The cables are galvanized, covered in a protective coating of zinc, which corrodes much more slowly than the underlying steel.
This is a wire from a cable from an existing bridge, a hanger cable. And you look at the condition of the cable. You can see the paint is peeling off, and you can see that there are places where there's red rust. That means that the coating on these wires, which are mostly galvanized coating, the galvanizing is failing. And so now you have a wire that's going to rust, and you may have failures by fracture of individual wires. Once you've broken enough of the wires, then you begin to break wires as kind of a cascade. And you'll see them fray, and then the rope will fail.
Just upriver from the Brooklyn Bridge, the city's most adventurous commuters once relied on another steel cable structure to get them into Manhattan. The only thing holding up the Roosevelt Island Tramway is a pair of nearly 2-inch diameter wire ropes. The weak point is the spot where the cables cross over the steel support towers.
Especially where the cable goes across over the saddles and at the terminals, the cable is bent back and forth as the tram goes across it. So you tend to get some fatigue loading in the cables. And that is what actually uses up the life of the cable.
In the time of humans, the cables were shifted roughly 100 feet every 5 years to keep any one point from being in contact with the towers for too long. Now, even though the tram hasn't moved along the cable for 100 years, wind has continued to buffet the tramway, causing stress on the wires near the towers. They snap, and the tram car plunges 250 feet into the East River. More than 200 years after she was given as a gift of friendship, from the people of France to the people of America, the Statue of Liberty still holds her torch high. This is actually the second torch to be held aloft by Lady Liberty. The first was replaced in the 1980s during a massive restoration project. Now, beneath her copper skin, only as thick as 2 pennies, her skeleton is beginning to fail.
The steel straps that hold the copper to the steel framework would pull away, the rivets would pull away over a period of 100 to 200 years.
Her end is not yet here, but without humans, it is inevitable. "150 years after people, at Rockefeller Center, where humans once had to truck in a tree to celebrate the holiday season, the greenery is now on permanent display. The skyscrapers that made New York famous have transformed into vertical ecosystems.
Towards the bottoms of the building, you'll begin to get rubble and soil accumulating. And you'll get things that like those sort of dry environments, things like oak and hickory and a wide variety of grasses. The higher up you go, the more wind you're going to have and the drier it's going to be. So those are places where the plants that colonize the outside of the building are going to be cliff dwellers.
150 years after people signals the beginning of the era of the great building collapses in New York City. Surprisingly, it's the newer buildings that are crumbling the fastest. While the walls of older buildings had to be strong, integral parts of the structure, new types of steel developed in the mid-20th century allowed most of a building's weight to be carried by the inner columns. So most of New York City's post-war skyscrapers were built using a glass and steel curtain wall technique, in which the outer walls just form a lightweight protective skin of steel and glass.
One of the big complaints New Yorkers have of newer buildings is that they all leak. Well, if they all leak while we're maintaining them, they're all going to leak a lot when we're not maintaining them. And so the most modern buildings would actually go first. It's the buildings that were built up through the 1940s that would last the longest.
"200 years after people, with the collapse of the modern skyscrapers, New York's silhouette is a throwback to the Great Depression." Both completed in the early 1930s, the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building once vied to be the tallest buildings in the world. The Chrysler held that crown for less than a year before the Empire State surpassed it. Now, the rivalry is over. The Empire State Building slips from the skyline. The Chrysler Building, the first of man's skyscrapers to stand taller than 1,000 feet, is once again the tallest building in the city. As before, its reign won't last for long. The deteriorating columns can no longer support the floors.
That's the critical point when a skyscraper becomes on the verge of total collapse. Several columns buckling in a single floor, allowing one floor to descend rapidly to another level below, would be sufficient to trigger a cascading collapse.
The skyline of New York is now unrecognizable. "300 years after people, Lady Liberty suffers a fatal relapse of an old complaint, galvanic corrosion. Her torch-bearing right arm is the first to fall. Then, other parts. But here, on the ocean floor, these shattered symbols of hope may become the fossils of the future.
The hand with a torch would, by that initial ballistic trajectory, embed itself maybe up to half a meter into the mud. And that impression may well stay, just in the way that footprints are preserved in mud and sand.
"1,000 years after people, New York's skyscraper canyons are now just canyons. Rivers flow where taxicabs once rolled.
Their course is going to follow what used to be the streets and are now these sort of pseudo-canyons at the bottom of these strangely shaped hills that are the rubble left of the skyscrapers.
Years after people. On the New York shoreline wanders a pack of wild horses, the descendants of the urban equines that thousands of years ago protected and entertained the humans of New York City. The high salt content in their seaside food supply means that they have to drink twice as much water as their domesticated ancestors once did. And the grasses here are so deficient in nutrients that the horses have evolved a shorter stature in response to the poor quality of their diet. Still, they have survived. Buried in the ground beneath their feet, a corroding steel crypt holds tight to its precious contents. Once 80 feet below street level, the Federal Reserve Gold Vault is now hundreds of feet underground and inundated with water from rising seas. Inside, the largest stockpile of gold ever assembled on Earth remains well preserved.
They're underground. They're encased in steel. Now, steel will be much less happy underground. If you look at archaeological iron steel implements, on the surface they rust. Underground they tend to pit and corrode.
Although the steel will eventually corrode, the gold bars themselves should last not just for thousands of years, but even millions.
When the future archaeologists find it, they're going to wonder about the culture that built such an amazing temple and sanctuary.
The 24-karat gold will live on as a precious metal. Once mined, molded, and guarded by humans, now returned to the Earth in a life after people.